Hello. Last session we began looking at the wider monastic estate beyond the cloistered precincts. The monastic houses became major landowners and highly efficient farmers, investing capital to improve their land. And those isolated sites, initially chosen for their remoteness and wildness, away from worldly temptations, were soon seen as a challenge to be improved, to be tamed, to be brought into productive cultivation. Gerald of Wales, commenting in the 12th century, said this: "Settle the Cistercians in some barren retreat which is hidden away in some overgrown forest. A year or two later you will find splendid churches there and monastic buildings with a great amount of property and all the wealth you can imagine." In the 13th century, Matthew Paris, a Benedictine monk at St Albans, was writing about the Fens and said this: "Concerning the marsh, a wonder has happened in our time. For in the years past, beyond living memory, these places were accessible neither for man nor for beast, affording only deep mud with sedge and reeds and inhabited by birds. Indeed, more likely by devils, as appears from the life of St Guthlac, who began to live there and found it a place of horror and solitude. This is now changed into delightful meadows and also arable ground. What does not produce corn or hay brings forth abundant sedge, turf and other fuel, very useful to the inhabitants of the region." It was the abbeys of Peterborough, Ramsey, Crowland, Ely and Spalding who set about draining the fens. The Somerset Levels were drained by the abbeys at Glastonbury, Muchelney and Athelney. In Yorkshire, the Vale of Pickering was drained. The marshes of southeast Kent were drained. This was large-scale activity that changed and reshaped the landscape. The uplands of northern England had been used as occasional rough pasture, but under the monasteries they are brought into more productive use, mainly for sheep but also for cattle. The Cistercians were chiefly associated with sheep and the Benedictines with arable, but the monastic orders were involved in agriculture of every conceivable type, and the unit of exploitation, the outlying monastic farm or grange, which we looked at in the last session, invented by the Cistercians, soon copied by the other orders. And there are still farms today working the same land as the monks, such as Alciston Court Farm in East Sussex. This was a grange belonging to the Benedictines of Battle Abbey, and a 14th century house, a barn survive, and the medieval dovecote you can see in the foreground. Sheep were important on all monastic estates. The Cistercians in particular were committed to wool production, for both the domestic market but also for export. Now, why the Cistercians and sheep? The Cistercians had an advantage. Pope Honorius III in 1221 had commanded that the rectors of parishes in which the Cistercians pastured their sheep were not to take tithes. And all the monastic orders have various privileges and exemptions from tolls. It gives them an advantage over ordinary farmers. The Cistercians of Fountains Abbey were the biggest players, with a flock that numbered 15,000 sheep at one time. The sheep farms are called beccaries and the cattle farms are called vaccaries. Now, monks are not exactly vegetarian, but they have lots of fast days and days when meat is prohibited. So cattle are kept mainly for dairy produce, milk and cheese, and sheep for wool. Much meat would be sold rather than consumed, but they're also using leather for shoes and for harness, calf skins for vellum, sheep and goat skins for parchment, and you find tanneries associated with many monasteries. These vats were at Rievaulx Abbey. The monasteries also owned mills for grinding grain and also for fulling wool. This 12th century watermill was attached to Fountains Abbey. Gives an idea of the scale of operation and investment. This watermill at Sturminster Newton on the River Stour was part of the Dorset estate of Glastonbury Abbey. Now, with a largely meat-free diet, there was a big requirement for fish, and most monastic sites had freshwater fish ponds. They often survive in the landscape as shallow, grassy hollows. They also had rights to river, lake and sea fisheries. This fish house at Mere in Somerset was owned by Glastonbury Abbey, and it housed the fishermen and their nets and provided a base for processing the catch from a nearby lake. Ancient Abbey in Oxfordshire created fish ponds in 1217 by diverting a road and a stream, and the fish ponds are the only visible remains of a once great abbey. Now, I mentioned monastic gardens in the last session, that they also had orchards, reed beds, willow halts and vineyards. There's an open area at Tewkesbury that is still known as the Vineyards. It was the scene of a major battle in the Wars of the Roses. Every aspect of agriculture is covered. Bees are kept. And the monastic houses get involved in commercial activity. They start fairs and markets, and they found towns, boroughs, laid out in planned streets with plots of land known as burgages that are offered for rent with various trading privileges. And many towns have their origins as monastic foundations: St Albans, Bury St Edmunds, Evesham, Burton-on-Trent. This range of late medieval shops in Tewkesbury represents a speculative commercial venture by Tewkesbury Abbey. In every area of agricultural and industrial and commercial activity in medieval England and Wales, the predominant force are the monasteries, and that translated into wealth and power and influence, and ultimately it undermined their religious role, and I'm going to turn to that theme next time. If you've enjoyed this video, hit the like and subscribe buttons and click on the notification bell to be informed when the next video is released, or you can subscribe by clicking on the rose window over my shoulder.